The Grand Hall of Valor had never been more silent, and that silence was its own kind of terror. Seren pressed herself into the narrow gap between two stone pillars at the back of the hall, her fingers curled around cold granite, her breath coming in careful and measured pulls. Around her, hundreds of wolves stood in rigid stillness, pack leaders in formal furs, noble bloodlines in silk and silver. Warriors who could crush stone with their bare hands, all of them with their chins slightly lowered, their shoulders drawn in, their eyes cast carefully toward the floor. Every single one of them was afraid. That was the thing about Cairo, Alpha King of Ethon, that no one ever said aloud, but everyone understood in the marrow of their bones. His presence did not merely command a room, it pressed down on it, like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air itself seems to understand that something vast and dangerous is about to move. His name was the thing mothers in the lower districts used when children would not sleep. His name was offered up in the same breath as prayers, proof that the world still had teeth. Women presented to him at formal gatherings turned their faces away, not out of modesty, out of survival instinct. Seren had been the only exception. That was her particular curse, or perhaps her particular gift, and she had never been entirely certain which. From the first morning she had crossed his path in the lower corridors of the castle, carrying linens for the East Wing where she worked as a mending servant. She had made the mistake that every Omega in royal service was specifically warned against. She had looked directly at him, not the careful downward glance her rank required, not the sideways half-acknowledgement mid-level wolves used when they could not avoid his notice. She had looked at him fully, with the open and unguarded attention she gave to everything that genuinely interested her. And in the fraction of a second before she corrected herself, she had seen something no story had prepared her for. He had looked exhausted, not tired, not short of sleep. Exhausted in the way that has nothing to do with the body and everything to do with carrying something alone for far too long. There was a weight behind his eyes she recognized, and beneath that weight, barely visible, a flicker of surprise, as if her fearless gaze had startled him more profoundly than her terror would have. She had thought about that look for longer than was wise. She had told herself it meant nothing. That had been 8 months ago. Now she stood at the back of the Grand Hall and watched the ceremony that would decide the future of Ethon, and she understood for the first time in 8 months exactly how badly she had miscalculated every single thing. The offering was a tradition older than the current bloodline. When an Alpha King reached his 10th year of rule without producing an heir, the noble houses had the right to present candidates for a formal bonding. It was less a romantic occasion than a political one, a structured negotiation dressed in ceremony and the pretense of choice. 5 women stood on the raised platform at the far end of the hall. Seren had watched each of them ascend the steps. 2 of them closed their eyes briefly when Cairo's gaze swept past them, as if the contact itself was something to be survived rather than received. Even the boldest of the 5, a tall woman from the northern mountain packs who had clearly been prepared for this moment since childhood, swallowed visibly when he stepped closer. At the center of the 5 stood Vespara of House Draveth. She was extraordinary in the particular way of women shaped since birth for a single purpose. Her dark hair was pinned with hammered silver. Her gown was the deep color of winter water. She stood without trembling, which was itself an achievement in Cairo's presence, though Seren noticed she was the only candidate who had not looked at him directly once. She faced slightly to his left, eyes fixed on the middle distance, like someone looking toward a bright source without quite meeting it. Seren's hands tightened against the pillar. For 8 months she had told herself a careful story about how a king and an Omega from the mending quarters existed in 2 entirely separate worlds, and how the hours stolen between those worlds belonged to no one and nowhere in any permanent sense. She had worn that story smooth with repetition. She had almost made herself believe it. The elder warden raised his ceremonial staff. Cairo, Alpha King of Ethon, sovereign of the Ironwood territories, last blood of the Grey Veil line, the old wolf intoned, his voice carrying through the silence with the weight of centuries of identical declarations. The houses have presented their candidates. The realm awaits your word. Cairo stood with his hands clasped behind his back. The stillness of someone who had learned very early how to make a body appear calm, regardless of what it contained. Then he moved. 4 measured steps. Vespara's hand raised in the traditional gesture of selection. I choose Vespara, he said, and his voice carried the flat and final weight of stone dropping into deep water. House Draveth will have its alliance. The hall erupted. Relief and celebration crashed together in a wave of sound. Nobles embraced. Warriors stamped their approval against the stone floor in rhythmic thunder. The great chandeliers shivered with the noise of a kingdom exhaling. Seren could not move. She stood frozen against her pillar while the sound broke over her, and she watched Cairo stand beside Vespara with her hand still raised in his, and she watched his face one final time. His eyes moved. In the chaos of celebration, in the precise moment when every other face in the grand hall was turned toward him with joy or relief, his gaze swept the room in a single controlled arc. Not openly searching, contained and deliberate. And for one fraction of a second, so brief it left no proof and could have been the invention of a desperate woman, those eyes found her in the shadows at the back of the hall. What she saw was not the expression of a man who had just secured his kingdom's future. It was the expression of a man being pulled under something he could not fight, watching the one thing that might have saved him disappear beneath the surface. Then it was gone. His face closed like a shutter coming down. The celebration swallowed everything. Serene walked out of the grand hall on legs that barely held her weight. She did not run until she reached the servants' corridor. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach as she ran, and she did not stop until the castle walls were behind her, and the winter dark wrapped itself around her like the only mercy left in the world. The secret she carried was small still, small and fierce, and entirely hers. For now. 6 weeks later, the village of Creswick had decided it knew everything about its newest arrival, and every single thing it believed was wrong. Her name was not Sarah. She was not a widow from the coastal provinces, though she had constructed that story with enough detail that it had settled into the village's understanding of her without resistance. She was not 30 years old, as the exhaustion in her face had led the midwife to assume. She was 23. Her name was Seren, and she was carrying the Alpha King's child. Creswick sat tucked into a fold of the Ashwood Hills 3 days of hard riding from the capital, at the end of a road that narrowed to a single track where it entered the valley. Traders came through twice each season. News from Valor arrived late and incomplete, filtered through multiple retellings until it bore only a passing resemblance to whatever had originally occurred. The wolves here were small pack people, self-sufficient and skeptical of anything originating from the capital's direction. Seren had chosen it for precisely those reasons. The cottage sat at the eastern edge of the village where cleared land surrendered to the first trees of the Ashwood. It had a leaking roof corner, a door that dragged against stone when the weather was damp, and a hearth that smoked in northern wind. She had repaired the door in the first week and learned to live with the rest. In exchange for the cottage, she worked 3 mornings each week alongside Emmerich, the village's elderly healer, a wolf who had managed Creswick's ailments for 4 decades, with the quiet competence of someone who had long since stopped finding any of it remarkable. He had accepted her help the way a man accepts someone offering to take one end of a heavy load he has been carrying alone, with relief so deep he barely acknowledged it. The child moved most in the hours before dawn. She had learned its rhythms, the restless turning in the deepest part of the night, the sharp kicks when she ate something warm, the long stillness during rain, as if the sound of water against the roof was something it had developed a preference for. She spoke to it sometimes, in a voice so low it barely qualified as sound. She never said his name. She had made herself a strict rule about that. The mark on her left hip was a different problem entirely. Among wolf kind, a claiming bite not completed into a full bond would begin to fade once the claiming wolf formally chose another mate. The mark would lighten within weeks. The deep ache beneath the scar would quiet. It was one of the body's practical adjustments to separation, a mercy written into the biology of her kind. The mark on Seren's hip had not faded by as much as a shade. It burned on cold nights. It ached when she turned east in her sleep, toward Valor, as if her body maintained an orientation toward something it refused to relinquish regardless of what her mind had decided. Twice she had woken from dreams so vivid and specific that she sat upright in the darkness, completely certain for one disoriented moment that she was somewhere else entirely, that the past weeks had been the dream and something else was still to come. She had stopped trying to understand it. What she could not stop was the news. It arrived the way all news arrived in Creswick, carried in pieces by traders passing between the Ashwood settlements and the larger towns beyond. She had disciplined herself not to ask questions, not to show more than passing interest when conversation turned to the capital. She was a coastal widow. She had no particular connection to Valor. But the news had begun arriving with a frequency and character that was difficult to dismiss. The eastern grain harvest had failed for the second consecutive season. 3 mid-territory pack communities had reported unusual aggression among their wolves, unprovoked conflicts, a strange resistance to the authority of local alphas. A trade delegation from the southern coast had been turned away at Valor's gates because the king was, as the official word had it, indisposed. Indisposed. Seren turned that word over in her mind for a long time the evening she first heard it. Cairo was not a man the word indisposed had ever been applied to. He had negotiated military terms with a broken arm and mentioned it to no one until the documents were signed. The idea of him being indisposed was not merely unlikely, it was structurally impossible. Something was wrong in Valor. She told herself it was not her concern. She almost managed to believe it. It was Tamsin who finally cracked the wall Seren had spent weeks building. Tamsin was the blacksmith's youngest daughter, 14 years old, and possessed of the particular talent common to youngest children in small communities, the ability to collect every fragment of information that passed through a village and redistribute it with total enthusiasm and no filter whatsoever. She had attached herself to Seren within days of her arrival and proved impossible to discourage. She arrived on a gray morning in early spring without knocking, dropped onto the stool near the hearth with the ease of someone who had decided the cottage belonged to her regardless of the formal arrangements, and announced that traders had come down the north road. 6 horses, she said. My father talked to them at the well for almost an hour. Is that so? Seren said, continuing to sort dried bark at her work table. They had news. Tamsin's voice shifted slightly, losing some of its brightness. About the king. Seren set down what she was holding. They say he is not resting at all, Tamsin continued. They say he has been searching for someone since midwinter, a woman. No one knows who she is. Not her name, not where she came from. Only that the king has sent wolves to every territory in Ethon and has not slept properly in weeks, and that anyone who raises the subject of the Draveth bonding with him gets removed from his presence immediately. She paused. Lord Crassian Draveth is furious. Vespara has not appeared publicly since the new year, and the king's wolves have been stopping travelers on every main road in the kingdom. Seren said nothing. Her hands sat very still in her lap. He offered a reward, Tamsin added, those observant dark eyes fixed on her. A substantial one, for any information leading to this woman's location. Seren made herself breathe. She made herself pick up the piece of bark she had set down and turn it in her fingers as if she were thinking about nothing more significant than the morning's work and the question of whether the batch had dried long enough to be useful. The affairs of kings, she said, keeping her voice perfectly level, are not something a village like this one needs to concern itself with. Tamsin accepted this in exactly the way she always accepted Serene's redirections, which was to say, not at all. She sat for several more minutes discussing the traders' horses and the flooding problem 2 settlements to the west, and then she left, pulling the dragging door shut behind her with the practiced lift and push she had learned from watching Seren do it. The cottage went quiet. Seren sat without moving. He was searching for someone. The person he searched for could be anyone. There was no logic in drawing a line from that information to herself. She had been meticulous. A different name, a different history, a deliberately indirect route from the capital that would defeat any attempt to trace a straight line from the castle to her door. She had arrived in Creswick as someone who did not exist in any record that anyone would think to examine. She was safe. She rose to carry the sorted bark to the storage shelf on the east wall, passing the narrow window, and doing what she always did without entirely admitting she was doing it, glancing toward the tree line at the edge of the ashwood. She stopped. There was a wolf at the tree line. A single wolf, large and absolutely still, standing in the shadow of the nearest oaks, with pale eyes that caught the thin spring light and held it. Not moving, not hunting, simply positioned at the exact boundary where cleared land met forest, watching the cottage with a focused and patient attention that had nothing animal in it. As she stood frozen at the window, a second wolf moved out of the trees to stand beside the first, then a third, then a fourth. 4 wolves, motionless, arranged along the tree line with the quiet deliberateness of creatures that had been waiting for some time and intended to continue waiting. Seren's hand moved to her stomach. They had already found her. The question that turned her blood to ice was not how they had done it. It was how long they had already been there before she thought to look. The knock came 3 minutes after she stepped back from the window. Not from the front of the cottage, where she would have expected it, but from the side door that opened onto the narrow strip of ground between the cottage wall and the herb garden. A door that only someone who had walked the full perimeter of the building would know existed. Seren stood in the middle of the room and did not move. The knock came again. Measured, patient. Not the urgent hammering of someone whose intentions required speed. "My lady." A male voice through the door, middle-aged, carrying the particular steadiness that comes not from an absence of fear, but from a great deal of practice managing it. "My name is Aldwin. I serve the Alpha King of Ethon as First Beta. I have been looking for you for 12 weeks. I am alone. The wolves at the tree line are mine, and they will not move unless I instruct them. I am asking you to open this door, and I am asking it rather than demanding it, because you have already been through enough." Seren stayed where she was. Then she crossed the room and opened the door. The man standing outside was older than his voice suggested. Dark hair with silver coming through at the temples. A face carrying the particular weathering of decades spent in service to something larger and more complicated than himself. His eyes were the deep amber of high-ranked wolves, and they held something she had not anticipated. Relief. Profound and completely unconcealed. "You are real," he said quietly, and the 3 words arrived with a weight that told her he had been genuinely afraid for a long time that he might be wrong about that. Seren stepped aside. "Come in." He entered, and she closed the door. Aldwin's gaze moved over her, taking in the pregnancy with an expression that moved from surprise into something more layered. Then he read her face, and whatever he found there made him speak without preamble. He did not choose her. He did not choose Vespara willingly. "I need you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because everything that follows will only make sense once you accept it as true." Seren sat down. Her legs had made the decision before she did. "House Draveth carries an ability that most of Ethon believes is myth," Aldwin said, lowering himself onto the stool across from her with the careful movements of a man who had covered a significant number of difficult miles recently. "An old compulsion. A blood ritual passed through their female line for generations. It was used twice in recorded history to manipulate alpha decisions in Draveth's favor. The King's Council considered it legend. Our scholars dismissed it entirely." He paused. They were wrong. Seren looked down at her hands. "A compulsion," she said. "Something done to him." 3 days before the offering, Vespara requested a private audience with the king. Standard protocol, all candidates were permitted one. What no one knew was that she arrived with a prepared compound derived from the blood ritual her family has been maintaining in secret for 4 generations, woven into a cup of ceremonial wine. Aldwin's jaw tightened. It does not simply cloud judgment the way a toxin might. It severs an alpha's connection to his wolf entirely, his instincts, his bond sense. It makes him capable of performing actions his true self would never choose, and leaves him with no memory of having done so. The cottage was very quiet. The empty eyes, Seren said, barely above a whisper. Aldwin looked at her steadily. You saw it. I thought I imagined it. You did not imagine it. Every other witness in that hall saw a king making a political choice. You saw a man something was being done to. He leaned forward slightly. The king instructed me that when I found you, I was to tell you this. That in the final moment before the compulsion sealed itself completely, when he took Vespara's hand and his wolf was fighting against what was being forced through him with everything it had, he searched the hall. He found you in the shadows. And you were the only person in that room who looked at him and understood that what was happening was not his choice. Seren pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. He said it was the last real thing he perceived before the darkness closed. Your face. And what it held. She had been right. She had known, and she had dismantled that knowledge piece by piece over 12 weeks because she was afraid of what it would cost her to hold on to it. She had taken the one true thing she had seen and talked herself out of it until it was nothing. He woke 4 days after the offering with no memory of the ceremony, Aldwin continued. He went to your quarters within the hour of regaining his senses. When he found them empty, he stopped. Restarted, more carefully. The first weeks were extremely difficult. I will not describe them in detail because it would not serve you to carry those images. What I will tell you is that he has not stopped searching. 12 weeks without any trail to follow or any fixed point to move toward. He paused, and in the pause, Seren heard the edge of something being deliberately held back. There is one more thing. Something I am not yet telling you, not because you lack the right to know it, but because I need you steady for what comes next. I will tell you the rest when there is time. Seren's eyes sharpened. That is not your decision. It is the decision I have made. Forgive me. Before she could press further, he reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the table between them. The wax seal was the Dreveth crest, a silver serpent pressed into black. Intercepted 2 days ago, Aldwin said, addressed to a courier service that handles assignments of a particular nature. Seren unfolded it. 8 words. The Omega has been located. Finish it cleanly. Below the words, a date. 5 days from now. She set the paper down on the table with hands that were very steady, which surprised her, because everything inside her was not. How close are they? She asked. Aldwin opened his mouth to answer. The side window exploded inward. Glass hit the stone floor in a cascade of sharp sound, and Aldwin was moving before the last fragment settled, his chair scraping back, his body placing itself between Seren and the window in a single fluid motion that had nothing improvised in it. The cellar, he said, his voice dropping to something flat and operational. Left wall, behind the second shelf. It is a dead end, Seren said. It buys time. Through the ruined window she could see movement between the trees. Not the still and watchful wolves who had been positioned at the tree line. These were different. Darker, moving in coordinated patterns through the undergrowth with a practiced, purposeful silence that was far more frightening than speed would have been. Aldwin's wolves had vanished from the tree line. She did not know if that was good or terrible. A sound from the front of the cottage, low and searching, told her she had seconds before the door came in. My wolves are engaging, Aldwin said, reading something in the sounds outside that she could not parse. 3 attackers in the rear, at least 2 on the approach to the front. They did not come to negotiate. He turned to look at her directly, and his expression was not the face of a man who believed the odds were favorable. The child. Whatever happens, protect the child. How do I do that with no way out? You wait. And if waiting fails, you fight. He shifted. The transformation took less than 2 seconds, the man folding into the wolf with a speed that made the air in the small cottage shudder. A large gray wolf stood where he had been, ears flattened, attention wholly directed at the front door. He crossed the room in 2 strides and went through the door before anyone on the other side could open it, the wood cracking outward against the force of him. Seren grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth. Outside, the sounds of the fight came to her in fragments, the collision of bodies. A yelp of pain, she could not tell whose. The sharp crack of something breaking. Then a howl cut off abruptly, which was worse than a howl sustained. She moved to the side wall, putting her back to the stone. The front door held for 30 seconds. Then it came open. 2 wolves entered in quick succession, dark-furred and moving with the low, careful posture of animals that had been given a specific task and were focused entirely on completing it. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for her. They found her. The first one lunged and she swung the poker, catching it across the muzzle with enough force to stagger it sideways. The impact ran up her arms like a bell strike. The second circled, positioning itself between her and the back door, cutting off the angle she had been calculating. She was not going to win this. She knew it with the calm clarity of someone who has already done the arithmetic and does not like the result. From outside, she heard a sound that stopped everything. Not a howl, not a battle sound. Something different. Something that moved through the air the way very large things move through still water, displacing everything around them with the sheer fact of their existence. Both wolves in the cottage went still. Then they bolted. Through the ruined front door, into the forest, moving with the speed of animals that had encountered something higher on the hierarchy than anything they had been prepared to face. Serene stood in the wreckage of her cottage with the poker still raised and listened to the silence that followed. The cottage looked as though it had been turned inside out. The side window was gone entirely, letting in a blade of cold air that stirred the dried herbs she had spent weeks preparing. The front door hung at an angle from a single hinge. Mud had been tracked across the stone floor she had cleaned that morning, and on the far wall, where one of the dark wolves had struck it during the fight, there was a crack running from the window frame to the ceiling that had not been there an hour ago. She had built something here, something small and functional and entirely hers. It had taken weeks. It had taken seconds to unmake. She set the poker down. Her arms were shaking, she noticed distantly, though her hands were still. It lasted 4 seconds. Then she heard Aldwin's voice from outside, hoarse and strained and not entirely his own yet. Seren. Her real name. The withheld thing. I need to tell you now, before he reaches the door. She went to the ruined doorway. Aldwin was in human form again, kneeling in the mud just outside with one hand pressed to his side where blood was soaking through his shirt. He looked up at her with the expression of a man clearing a debt. The compulsion severed his bond sense entirely, Aldwin said. Not partially. Entirely. For the first 9 weeks of searching, he could not feel you at all. No pull. No warmth. No signal of any kind from the bond. He held her gaze. He searched blind. Nothing guiding him but his own certainty that you existed and that you mattered. 9 weeks, Seren. No map. No trail. No confirmation that you were even alive. He paused. The bond only began to return to him 3 weeks ago. Faintly. That is when we finally started getting close. Seren stared at him. He searched for you without the bond? She said slowly. Without anything. A sound from the tree line, large, approaching fast. Aldwin looked past her and closed his eyes briefly. He is here, he said. Whatever you feel right now, whatever you are not ready for, it does not matter. He is here. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, not the crack of undergrowth under a large body, something else entirely. A sound at the low edge of perception, more felt than heard, the way the ground sometimes registers a distant storm before the ears do. It moved through the air and through the earth simultaneously, and it made the mark on her hip ignite with a heat so sudden and total that she gasped and pressed her hand flat against it through her dress. Then he came out of the tree line. He was in human form, which surprised her. She had half expected the wolf, had braced herself for something vast and elemental bursting from the forest, the way things did in the old stories. Instead, a man walked toward her across the cleared ground, tall and dark-haired, and wearing a traveling coat that had seen several days of hard use. He was not running. He was walking with the deliberate and very carefully controlled pace of someone managing something enormous by sheer force of concentrated will. He stopped 6 feet from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Seren looked at him with the same open attention she had always given him, the attention that saw past surfaces into the truth of things, and what she saw undid several of the carefully constructed walls she had spent 12 weeks building. He looked as though he had been in a war. Not the obvious kind, with visible wounds and clean recoveries. The kind that happened inside, slowly, over weeks, leaving marks that did not show easily but were everywhere once you knew how to look. The shadows under his eyes were deep enough to suggest that sleep had been a stranger for a long time. His face was leaner than she remembered, stripped of whatever softness had occasionally appeared in unguarded moments, and the lines around his mouth had deepened into something permanent. His eyes found hers and did not move from them. Then his gaze dropped to the unmistakable curve of her body under her dress. She watched him absorb it. Watched the information move through him like a slow wave, the initial stillness, and then something shifting in his expression so fundamentally that it was like watching a landscape change. He took one involuntary step forward and then stopped himself, and both hands rose slightly at his sides before he caught them and stilled them. "May I?" he said, and his voice was so different from the last time she had heard it that for a second she did not recognize it as his. Low and roughened, almost a question that was not yet finished. "May you what?" she said. He looked at her. "Come closer." The simplest request she had ever heard from him. No command in it. No assumption. Just a man standing in the cold asking for something he understood he had no right to demand. Seren did not move toward him, but she did not move away. "You knew," she said, "about the Draveth ability. Someone warned you before the private audience and you went anyway." Something crossed his face. Not denial. Acknowledgement. Immediate and undefended. "I was told it was a story," he said. "A fabrication passed around by houses who resented the Draveth influence. 2 council members raised it as a caution, and I dismissed them." He paused. "I believed nothing Vespara carried into that room could reach past my bond with you, that my wolf would not allow it." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong. My certainty cost you everything." Seren felt something shift inside her, and she was not entirely sure whether it was anger or grief, or something that was both simultaneously. "You were arrogant," she said. "Yes. You had something worth protecting, and you treated your own confidence as protection enough." "Yes. And while you were wrong about that, I was standing in a servants' gallery watching you raise another woman's hand in front of the entire kingdom, with your child growing inside me, believing I had meant nothing. Believing every moment we had was a convenient fiction for a man who had always known exactly who he would choose when the time came." She heard her own voice and was surprised by the steadiness of it. Not cold, not brittle, simply honest, the way she had always been honest, looking directly at what was true and not looking away. She had rehearsed this moment in the dark hours before dawn more times than she could count, lying in a strange bed in a village that was not hers, with her hands on her stomach, and the mark on her hip burning, and the shape of his absence filling every corner of the room she was in. She had composed speeches, elegant ones, precise ones, ones that cut cleanly and ones that simply bled. She had imagined saying all of them. What came out instead was the truth, plain and without architecture. Cairo's eyes did not leave her face. He did not attempt to move toward her or to speak. He received each word without deflection, and she understood with a certainty that required no interpretation that he was not merely tolerating this. He was choosing it. He was standing in front of her and choosing to be accountable for what his actions, however coerced and however partially his fault, had cost her. 3 days after you disappeared, he said when she finished, I stood in your empty quarters for a very long time. I want you to understand what that was like. You had taken everything, every trace that you had been there, no belongings, no note, nothing to indicate you had ever occupied that room at all. And all I had was 4 days of missing time and the absolute certainty that I had done something that I could not remember and could not undo, and that you had believed the worst of me because I had given you exactly enough evidence to make the worst the only logical conclusion. He stopped, started again. I searched for you without the bond, Seren. I need you to understand that. No pull, no warmth, no sense of direction. For 9 weeks, I searched an entire kingdom with nothing but the knowledge that you existed and that I had failed you, and that I would not stop until I found you, because the alternative was to accept a version of my life in which you were not in it. And that version was not something I was capable of choosing. His voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically. A small fracture that he did not attempt to hide. Seren looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the 6 feet of cold ground between them and took his face in her hands, tilting it down toward her, and she made herself look at him with everything she had, the way she had always looked at him, with all of her attention and none of her defenses, until she could see what was true. What she saw was a man who had made a mistake he could not take back, who had paid an enormous price for it, and who was standing in front of her with nothing held in reserve, no protection, no performance, asking to be seen clearly and accepting whatever that meant. I believe the worst of you, she said quietly, because I was afraid that if I believed anything else and was wrong, it would kill me. And I had someone else to stay alive for. Caro's hands came up very slowly and covered hers where they held his face. I know, he said. That does not mean I forgive everything immediately. I know that too. She pressed her forehead to his chest and felt the slow and very deliberate way he folded his arms around her, careful, as if she were something that could still choose to leave at any moment, and he was not going to make that choice difficult through force of any kind. The child, she said against his shirt. Children, she corrected herself. She felt the moment he understood. The stillness. Then the slight tightening of his arms. 2, he said, barely a breath. 2. He was silent. She felt his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and fast, and through the bond, which was burning between them now with a heat she no longer had any intention of suppressing, she felt what he felt. Not just relief, not just love, though both of those were present, enormous and undeniable. Something deeper, something that had no clean name. The specific quality of a person who has been searching in the dark for a very long time and has finally, at great cost and with no certainty of success, found what they could not have survived permanently losing. Behind them, Aldwin's quiet voice came from the doorway. The Draveth forces have withdrawn, for now. There are more coming. Cairo's arms tightened slightly. I know, he said, and his voice had changed again, settled into something with steel in it that had been absent from everything he had said in the last several minutes. We are not staying here. Seren pulled back enough to look at him. Where are we going? His eyes found hers and held them. Home, he said, and through whatever is between us and it. They rode through what remained of the night and into the gray edge of a reluctant dawn, Seren seated in front of Cairo on a horse that had clearly been pushed hard to reach Creswick and was now being asked to carry twice the expected weight without complaint. Aldwin rode behind them at a careful distance. His wound had been dressed with what remained of Seren's medicinal supplies, and though he moved with the slight stiffness of someone managing more pain than he was acknowledging, he had refused the suggestion that he rest. The bond is changed, Cairo said, after they had been riding in silence long enough for the lights of Creswick to disappear behind the hills. His arm was around her waist and his voice came from just above her ear, low and careful. Since it began returning 3 weeks ago, different from how it was before. Steadier. Seren considered that. Because of the children? Partly. A pause. And partly because I nearly lost it entirely, and that changes how you hold what you have. She had nothing to say to that which would not open something she was not yet ready to have open on horseback in the dark with Aldwin 15 yards behind them, so she said nothing, and he did not push her to. What he did instead was talk. Not about the compulsion or the Draveth family or the state of the kingdom. He talked about the search. The 9 weeks of moving through his own territory as a stranger, following nothing, guided by no instinct beyond the bone-deep refusal to stop. He described the second week, when his council had formally proposed that he accept the Draveth alliance as binding and begin the process of legitimizing his public choice. He described the meeting in precise terms, what was said, what he said in return, and what expression had been on Lord Crassian Draveth's face when Cairo had made it clear in the plainest possible language that no such process would be occurring. He described a village in the Ashwood Midlands, the 5th week, where a child had told him she had seen a woman with Seren's coloring passing through in winter, and how he had spent 3 days in that village following a trail that turned out to belong to someone else entirely. How he had sat by the road on the 3rd evening and understood for the first time that this might not resolve the way he needed it to, and what he had decided in that moment. "What did you decide?" Seren asked. "That it did not matter," he said. "Whether it resolved or not. I was going to keep looking. Not because I had calculated favorable odds, because there was no version of stopping that I was capable of choosing." Seren looked at the road ahead in silence. "You terrify people," she said. "Everyone who encounters you, even wolves who have served you for years, they manage it, but it is always there, that particular quality in a room when you enter it." "I am aware. I was never afraid of you," she said. "From the first morning, I looked at you, and I did not see what everyone else saw." She felt, rather than heard, the slight change in his breathing. "I saw someone who was exhausted all the way down, someone carrying something alone that had become too heavy and who had stopped expecting anyone to notice." She paused. "That is what I saw. That is what I have always seen. And I need you to know that nothing that happened in the months between that morning and this road has changed what I see when I look at you." The only sound was the horses and the wind. "Seren," he said, and the single word held everything he was not yet able to organize into sentences. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She leaned back against his chest and felt his arm tighten around her, and they rode in silence through the pale beginning of morning with the road to Valor unrolling ahead of them, and the bond between them burning with a warmth that was no longer desperate or searching but simply, deeply present. She had not said the 3 words yet, not aloud, not to him directly. The bond was saying them continuously, in the language that needed no words. The warmth and the particular quality of attention that moved between them now with the ease of something that has been practicing a long time and finally has the room it needs. She felt his awareness of her on the road as something specific and present, not the frantic searching pulse that Aldwin had described from the dark weeks of the hunt, but something that had settled into itself. She thought about the village in the Ashwood Midlands that he had described, the wrong trail, 3 days following a woman who was not her, and the evening by the road when he had decided. She thought about what that decision had looked like from the inside, the choice to continue without any rational basis for choosing it, the kind of faith that is not comfortable or consoling but simply refuses to become something else. She thought about that, and about the mark on her hip that had refused to fade, and about 2 children who had been alive in the dark of the worst months, unknowing and peaceful, and she thought that some things were simply not made to break, no matter how much force was applied to them. She understood, with the clarity that had always been her particular gift, that the right moment had not yet arrived. When it came, she would know. They reached the outer boundaries of Valor's territory at midday, and something was wrong before they saw a single wall or gate. Seren felt it first. A quality in the air. A tension in the landscape that reminded her of the way animals went quiet before a storm. Not the ordinary stillness of a resting countryside, but the held-breath silence of a place that has recently contained violence or is currently expecting it. The birds that should have been moving through the upper fields were absent. The farmholds they passed were shuttered despite the hour. Cairo felt it too. His arm around her shifted in a way that was not comfort, but preparation. Aldwin brought his horse alongside them. "Something has happened," he said. A rider emerged from a copse of trees to the north, moving fast and angling toward them with the deliberate urgency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. He reached them breathing hard and did not dismount. "My king." Young, one of Cairo's outriders by his insignia, and shaken enough that he was having difficulty organizing his words. "The Draveth forces moved last night. They had people inside the eastern gate. The garrison was overwhelmed before the alarm could be raised." He stopped and started again. "Lord Crassian Draveth is in the Grand Hall. He holds 34 people as assurance against your cooperation, servants and guards, who would not bend the knee when the gates were taken. He has declared himself regent and sent word to the outer territories that the king has been compromised, and the succession is in question." A muscle moved in Cairo's jaw. "Nothing else." "There is more," the outrider said, and his voice dropped in the way voices do when the thing that follows is worse than what came before. "Some of your wolves inside the walls are not themselves. We do not know how many. They are not fighting for Draveth openly, but they are not responding to commands or recognizing authority. They stand and they watch, and they do not move." He paused. "It looks like the compulsion." Extended. Spread to multiple wolves at once. Seren's stomach tightened. "He prepared for exactly this," she said quietly. "Not just taking the stronghold. Disabling enough of your own wolves that even if you retook the walls, you would be fighting through your own people to reach him." Cairo looked at her. She could see him thinking through it with the rapid and unsentimental efficiency of someone who had been trained to think clearly in exactly this kind of situation. "If the compulsion is what I believe it to be," Seren continued, "then it cannot be broken from the outside. It has to be disrupted at its source, from within." "You are not going inside those walls?" Cairo said. "Not a question. Not a negotiation. I am telling you what I understand about the problem. What you do with that understanding is your decision." She met his gaze evenly. "For now." He studied her face for a moment longer than was comfortable. Aldwin's voice came from beside them. "Among the hostages," he said carefully, "there is a woman named Bryn, senior servant of the Eastern Quarters for 22 years. I recognize the description in the Outrider's report." Seren went still. Bryn, who had moved Seren's few possessions to a better room without being asked when winter arrived and the Eastern Corridor grew cold, who had noticed, months before anyone else could have, the particular way Seren's schedule had begun to change, and who had said nothing and covered for nothing, and simply adjusted her own rounds so that the corridors were reliably clear at the times they needed to be clear. Bryn, who had never asked a single question. "How many of the people inside that hall," Seren said, "stayed loyal because of who they are, and not because they calculated the odds?" No one answered, because the question did not need an answer. Outside the walls of Valor, Cairo's assembled wolves were gathering in the fields to the west, hundreds of them, more arriving through the afternoon, their presence making the air hum with contained force. It should have felt like enough. It did not feel like enough. Cairo stood apart from his advisors for a moment, looking at the city walls with an expression she had learned to read. Not anger. Something more controlled than anger and more dangerous because of it. The expression of a man doing arithmetic on a problem that keeps arriving at outcomes he is not willing to accept. He turned toward her, and she saw the exact moment he understood what she was thinking. "No," he said quietly. "I have not said anything yet," she said. "You have not needed to." She held his gaze without dropping it, the way she held every difficult thing, directly and without flinching, and she felt through the bond the exact shape of his resistance, how deep it ran and what it was made of. And she understood that it was made entirely of love and entirely of fear, and that neither of those things changed what she could see. Seren looked at the walls and thought about Bryn, who had covered for her without asking why, and about a hall full of people whose loyalty was about to cost them everything, and about a compulsion spreading through Cairo's wolves like frost through standing water, and she understood with the quiet certainty that had always been the most fundamental thing about her, that there was something here only she could do. She began to plan. The battle for the outer walls lasted 2 hours and cost more than Cairo was willing to calculate while it was happening. His wolves were extraordinary. Seren watched from the hill and saw what an alpha's wolves looked like when they were fighting for something that mattered at the most fundamental level. Every wolf in that field understood what was at stake, and that understanding produced something that military efficiency alone could not. But inside the walls, among the wolves that Draveth's compulsion had claimed, the situation was exactly as the outrider had described. They stood at gates and corridors, and did not fight against Cairo's forces. But they did not open doors either, and they did not respond to any command, and their eyes, when Seren watched them through a borrowed lens, had the particular flat emptiness she recognized from the grand hall on the night of the offering. Compelled, severed from themselves. Being used as obstacles by a man who understood that the most effective way to defeat an alpha was to turn what he loved against him. Aldwin found her on the hill as the outer walls fell. "The grand hall is barricaded," he said, pressing his hand to his side with the expression of a man who had decided pain was a later problem. 34 people inside. Draveth has activated the full ritual, not just the targeted compulsion he used on the king. It is radiating outward. Every wolf within range who has any susceptibility is being affected. He looked at her. It will keep spreading. Unless the ritual is interrupted. Unless someone who cannot be compelled walks through it and dismantles it from the source. He met her gaze. "I have read everything we have on this, Seren. The blood ritual works by feeding on fear, on the instinct to flee or submit. Someone who does not carry those responses in the same way others do could theoretically walk through it unaffected." He paused. Someone whose truth sight reads through it rather than responding to it. She had already known. She had known since the Outrider's report. And before that. Since the moment she had held the assassin's letter and understood that House Draveth had been planning this for years. Cairo reached the hill as the last of the outer gates opened. His coat was torn at the shoulder and there was blood on his hands that was not his. His eyes found her immediately, with the directness that had always been one of the things she could not look away from. She did not give him the chance to speak first. "I need to go inside the hall," she said. "Alone, without a weapon and without an escort, because anything that looks like a threat will accelerate the ritual and put the hostages at immediate risk. I need to reach Draveth directly, and I need to use what I can see to end what he has started." She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. "You know I am right." The silence that followed was the quality of a very controlled person managing something that wanted very much to be uncontrolled. "I know no such thing," he said. "Cairo. You are carrying 2 children. You are standing in front of a barricaded hall full of people who want you dead. And you are asking me to step aside. I am asking you to trust what you know about me." She moved toward him and put her hand against his chest, over his heartbeat. "You searched for me without the bond, without any signal. For 9 weeks you moved through the dark on nothing but your own conviction. That is the only kind of faith that counts. The kind that holds, when there is nothing to hold on to." She looked up at him. "I need that from you now." He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt through the bond the exact shape of what he was deciding and what it cost him to decide it. "If anything happens to you," he said, very quietly, "I will take this city apart stone by stone." "I know," she said. "That is why nothing is going to happen to me." She started to turn. His hand caught hers. She looked back. "Seren," he said. The word held something that had been building since the road before dawn, since the cottage in Creswick, since the ceremony in the grand hall that had been the worst night of both their lives. "I know," she said again. She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she said the three words she had been carrying since the morning she first looked at him and saw the truth of him. The words she had told herself were not ready, and understood now with perfect clarity had simply been waiting for the right moment. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since before I knew what to call it. That is not changing regardless of what happens in the next hour." She turned and walked toward the grand hall doors before he could say anything that would make leaving harder. She heard him say it back. 3 words, low and certain, carrying the weight of 9 weeks of darkness and a bond that had refused to break, even when everything else did. She did not stop walking, but she carried the words with her through every step that followed. The grand hall doors were open, which she had not expected. Lord Crassian Draveth was not a man who wasted gestures. The open doors meant he had known she was coming and had decided to let her come, which meant he believed she could be managed, which meant he did not yet understand what she was. She walked inside. The hall was larger than she had imagined and darker, the high windows covered with heavy cloth, the only light coming from iron braziers placed at intervals along the walls. 34 hostages knelt in 2 rows before the raised platform at the far end, their hands bound and their faces carrying the expression of people who have been afraid too long and have begun conserving the energy that fear requires. Among them, third from the left in the second row, was Bryn. Their eyes met. Bryn's expression moved through recognition and grief and a fierce, suppressed warning, all in the space of a second. On the raised platform, in a chair that was not quite a throne but had clearly been positioned to suggest one, sat Lord Crassian Draveth. He was older than Seren had expected, lean and gray-haired with the careful stillness of a man who had been patient for a very long time and was comfortable with patience as a strategy. His eyes, when they found hers, were the color of cold water and held nothing warm. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, stood Vespara. "The Omega," Draveth said pleasantly. "I wondered which of you would come through that door. I had assumed it would be the king." "You were wrong," Seren said. She felt it then, the ritual, not as an abstraction or a concept, but as a physical presence in the air of the hall, thick and particular, pressing against her perception the way heat presses against skin. It was designed to find fear and amplify it, to find the wolf's instinct to flee or submit and make it overwhelming, to reduce whatever walked into it to something manageable. She felt it looking for those things in her. She felt it find the truth site instead. The pain that followed was not like anything she had a name for. The pain was total and immediate, and then it changed. It did not stop. But it shifted, the way fire shifts when it finds a different kind of fuel, moving from the blunt force of impact to something more specific. The ritual was not designed for someone whose fundamental nature was to see through things. It had no mechanism for managing perception that simply refused to be distorted. It pushed and she looked directly at it, the way she had always looked directly at everything, and what she saw was the structure of it, the specific points where it was constructed and maintained, the threads that ran from the compound in Draveth's ritual vessel on the platform to the wolves standing vacant throughout the hall, the lines of compulsion running outward through the walls to the wolves in the courtyards and corridors beyond. She saw all of it, clear and particular, the way she might see the framework of a poorly constructed building and understand exactly which stone, removed, and would bring the rest down. The mark on her hip was no longer burning, it was blazing. And below it, in the place where she had felt the children move restlessly for months, something else entirely had begun. Interesting," Draveth said from the platform, watching her. "You are still standing. I did not design for that." "No," Seren agreed through the pain. "You designed for everyone who was afraid of him. You never designed for the one who was not." She pressed her palms together. The light that came was not the golden warmth she might have expected. It was white and very precise, the color of clarity rather than comfort, and it moved from her hands not in a flood but in directed lines, following the exact paths she had mapped in the air of the hall. Each line of compulsion she had seen, she followed with the light. Not destroying, because that was not her nature. Simply illuminating. Showing each compelled wolf the truth of what was being done to them, rather than what the ritual was telling them to feel. The first wolf by the door shook its head, then looked around as if waking. Then the second. Draveth was on his feet. "Stop her!" he said, and his voice for the first time held something other than pleasantry. But the wolves he was commanding were no longer his. The shift happened fast after that. 6 wolves in the hall moving to place themselves between the hostages and Draveth's remaining human guards. The ropes on the hostages' wrists cut by hands that had regained their purpose. Bryn, freed, looking at Seren across the hall with an expression that was equal parts recognition and astonishment. Vespara moved from the shadows with a small blade, angled towards Seren with the precise and economical motion of someone who had been trained for exactly this contingency. She crossed half the distance. The grand hall doors came off their hinges. Cairo came through them in wolf form, which she had not expected, and which was apparently also not something anyone else in the hall had expected. Judging by the way every human guard simultaneously stopped being interested in what they had been assigned to do and became interested exclusively in being somewhere else. Vespara stopped. The wolf that was Cairo was not the unanchored, radiating thing that had made people flee from him their entire lives. What came through that door was something different. Still enormous. Still unmistakably the most powerful wolf in 3 kingdoms. But contained now. Directed. Present in the way that true mates made each other present. Anchored by a bond that was burning between them with the force of something that had been tested past breaking and had held. Vespara dropped the blade. Lord Crassian Draveth stood on the platform and looked at the hall around him with the expression of a man watching a calculation he had spent years perfecting arrive at the wrong result. "It is over," Seren said. She was exhausted in the way of someone who has poured something fundamental into a task that required it. But she was standing. "Your compulsion is broken. Your wolves are themselves again. Your guards have reconsidered their commitments, and whatever you intended to accomplish in the next hour has already failed." Draveth studied her. "You are an Omega," he said, and the contempt in the word was the specific contempt of a man who believes in hierarchy as a fundamental truth and has just watched that truth refuse to apply. "Yes," Seren said simply. "I am." Cairo shifted, and the man stood where the wolf had been, and he crossed the hall to Draveth with a directness that left no room for any interpretation of what came next. Draveth's guards did not move to stop him. Later, in the quiet of a restored hall with the Draveth forces secured and the hostages attended to, and Bryn sitting near a brazier with a cup of something warm and a look on her face that suggested she was revising several assumptions about the world, Cairo found Seren sitting on the steps of the platform. He sat beside her. They did not speak for a while. "I want to complete it," he said finally. "The bond." Both of them understood. "If you are willing. When you are ready." Seren considered him. His hands rested on his knees, and she could see the slight tension in them, the held-back quality of someone who had learned to contain a great deal and was continuing to contain it even now. She took his hand. "Tell me what you saw," she said quietly. "When you felt it returning. The bond. 3 weeks ago, when it first came back. What did you actually feel?" He considered their joined hands. "You," he said. "Just you. Not a direction or a signal. Just the specific quality of your presence somewhere in the world. The way a room feels different when you are in it." He paused. "I wept. Which is not something I had done since I was 6 years old. I wept for approximately 4 minutes in the middle of a road in the Ashwood Hills, and then I rode faster." Seren felt something in her chest complete itself. She tilted her head, baring the side of her throat, the way she had understood instinctively from the first days of the bond that she would one day do. Complete it. she said. He did. What followed was not pain, though it began like pain. It was the peculiar and overwhelming sensation of a space inside her that had been shaped like him, shaped by months of knowing him and then months of losing him, suddenly filled with the actual living truth of him rather than its absence. She felt everything, not in sequence, but simultaneously, the way certain truths arrive all at once. His first sight of her, before she knew he had seen her, in a lower corridor with her arms full of linen and her face turned toward the window. How she had looked. What it had done to the thing in his chest that had been quiet for 30 years. The weeks that followed. The months. The way he had built toward her by small degrees because he understood she startled easily, and he was in no hurry, and everything about her was worth being patient for. The night of the offering through his perception. Not the ceremony she had watched, but the prison of it, fighting something he could not name, aware on some level beneath awareness that something catastrophic was happening, and unable to do anything except search the room for her face one last time. Finding it, holding it for the fraction of a second before the darkness took the last of him, her face, open and clear and unafraid. Seeing him, the 9 weeks. She had thought she understood them from Aldwin's account. She had not understood them. The specific texture of searching blind, the daily choice to continue not because he had hope, but because he had decided. The way his wolf had howled in the night toward a bond sense with nothing on the other end. And how he had still held on to the knowledge of her, the way a person holds onto a rope in the dark, hand over hand, simply not letting go. When she released him and they both came back to the hall around them, Seren found that she was holding his face in her hands exactly as she had outside the cottage, and that there were tears on her face that she had not been aware of producing. He looked at her, the way he had never looked at anything else. The way a person looks at the thing they searched for in the dark and found. I saw myself through your eyes, he said, the first morning, the corridor. I know, she said. I felt you feeling it. You were not afraid. I know what I saw. He pressed his forehead to hers and they stayed like that for a while, in the quiet of a restored hall. With the bond between them finally complete and permanent and sealed in both directions, and the children moving gently in the space between them, as if they too understood that something that had been wrong for a very long time had finally been made right. After a moment, Seren pulled back enough to look at him directly. 2, she said. A boy and a girl. The midwife in Creswick thought so, and I believe she was right. She watched him receive this fully, without the shock of the first telling, with nothing between him and the fact of it. What she saw in his face was the word home, arriving as a feeling rather than a concept. A boy and a girl, he said quietly. Yes. He said nothing else. He did not need to. The judgment of House Draveth took place before the assembled packs of Ethon in the 3rd week after the battle, and it was attended by every pack leader in the kingdom, which had not happened in 20 years, and said something about how the realm understood the weight of what had been done. Lord Crassian Draveth was stripped of his lands, his title, and the blood ritual his family had maintained in secret for 4 generations, which the king's scholars documented and then destroyed. He was imprisoned in the northern holds for the remainder of his life, which was more merciful than several pack leaders had advocated. Mercy was Seren's suggestion. Cairo had agreed with the expression of a man who disagreed, but had decided to trust someone whose judgment he valued more than his own anger. Vespara was not imprisoned. Seren had argued against it, on the grounds that Vespara had been shaped by her family's ambitions before she was old enough to choose otherwise. That did not absolve what she had participated in, but it changed what the appropriate response was. She was stripped of her family name and sent to serve in a healing house in the eastern provinces, where her considerable ability could be directed toward something that did not require destroying anyone. The kingdom healed in the months that followed with the pace of something that has been under long pressure and, released, takes time to find its natural shape again. The wolves that had been compelled recovered fully once the ritual was destroyed. The eastern grain stores came back. The pacts that had been fractious quieted. The people of Ethon received their true queen with a response that surprised Seren more than she wished to admit. She had prepared herself for skepticism. She had been wrong. Wolves trusted what they felt, rather than what they had been told. What they felt from their king since the bond was completed was a steadiness they had not felt before. The quality of an alpha no longer radiating the uncontrolled force of someone unanchored. They connected that quality to her. Not through reasoning, through instinct. And Omega had looked at the most feared alpha in 3 kingdoms when every other woman had turned away. What she had seen had turned out to be the truth of him. And that truth turned out to be something worth building a kingdom around. The twins were born on a morning in early spring when the ashwood was beginning to turn green again after the long winter. A boy with Cairo's dark hair and Serene's particular quality of attention, already watching the room with an expression of serious and open interest that made Aldwin, when he first held him, say that the kingdom was either going to be in extraordinary hands or a great deal of trouble depending on how it went. A girl with eyes that were her father's color and her mother's unflinching quality of look, who arrived in the world apparently already confident that it was a place worth examining. Cairo held them both at once, which was impractical, and which he refused to acknowledge was impractical, sitting on the edge of the bed with one in each arm and an expression on his face that Seren had never seen on it before, and that she understood she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had been there to see. "You looked at me," he said quietly, not to the children, but to her. "In a corridor. When no one else would." "I saw what was true," she said. "And you stayed." "I saw something worth staying for." Outside the window, somewhere in the city below, a wolf began to howl. Then another. Then a third. The sound built the way such things build in wolf communities, voice joining voice without coordination and without planning, until the whole of Valor was raising its throat to the sky in a register that had no single translation, but that every wolf understood as something close to the word joy. Seren listened to it and felt the bond between her and Cairo warm in response, steady and permanent, and no longer searching. It had found what it was looking for. So had she. Thank you so much for listening. We hope this story found you well.